And with that, I will turn it over to our speaker today, Raj Mangrolkar. He's the Associate Dean for Medical Student Education and Associate Professor of Internal Medicine and Learning Health Sciences. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Raj.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to this new wonderful world of Zoom, where I'm going to this is going to be a first for me, trying to do a workshop on Zoom. That's not something I've done yet. I've done a lot of talks, but so this will be an interesting journey. I'm really appreciative that you all have chosen to come today. I'll tell you, the hat that I'm wearing today is not as Associate Dean, but is really in my role as someone who's deeply interested in innovation. And as Executive Director of RISE, I've been given the opportunity to try and help enable a culture of innovation here at Michigan Medicine. And I'd like to share some different perspectives from outside of medical education and outside of medicine on the work that we do in making change happen, and hopefully shape a new approach to doing the things we do. Hopefully you're all here because you consider yourself innovators as well, and you're trying to make change happen, whether it be small or big. Change is an important part of how we continue to improve and also transform. But oftentimes we don't give a lot of thought to how we change and put into place plans to do it in a deliberate way. I hope I'm able to influence you to think that how is just as important as why and what by the end of our workshop today. Before we start, I know as Laura mentioned, the slides were shared with you, but I'd ask you not to open those. I'm going to share my slides, and we'll kind of walk us through what I hope will be a mix of both didactic and interactive components to really kind of get you all to be engaged with me in what I hope will be a fun workshop that we'll all have together. So thanks for joining. Give me a second to share my screen, and we will now get started. Molly, just give me a thumbs up that you see my screen. Great. So as I titled the talk, this is about, the workshop is about analyzing how change happens. So I'm going to ask you to put on your analytic hat as you go through here. And just be clear that sometimes analysis requires critique, and critique sometimes means that we're going to be talking about things that are difficult in the environment that we work in. So just know that we will be sharing, I'll be trying to be as transparent and honest as to the difficulties of innovation. It doesn't cast aspersions to our institution or to individuals. It's just that change is hard. And change in education may be harder than change anywhere else. My disclosures here is that the work that will be presented is really reflective of not my work, but really the work of hundreds of people here at the University of Michigan Medical School. So please know that. And some of it has been supported by a series of grants that we've been fortunate to receive from the American Medical Association's Accelerating Change in Medical Education. Both the Phase 1 Consortium, Phase 2, and a couple of other separate grants that we've been able to get as well. Those grants help support our deliberate thinking, but also some of the transformative work that we've done together as a community. So as we start, I'll ask you to remember two quotes. First, from Charles Darwin, that preeminent medical educator, that it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but rather the one that is most responsive to change. And I will also say that that's a double-edged sword, because change is hard. And when the winds of change blow hard enough, the most trivial of things can turn into deadly projectiles. How do we hold both of those together in medical education? And that will really kind of present the substrate of what we're going to be working on today. I'm going to ask you to think about change in terms of management. Management is really about how we do things. And there are two lenses that I'd like to present with two stories that hopefully will then get you to think about your own journey as an innovator. The first lens is that of crisis management, where a crisis presents itself and an organization needs to respond. And then the second is change management, where an organization or a person needs to identify deliberate steps to making change happen. And I'm going to present these two as concepts for us to reflect on as we go through, but build on our understanding of both of these by drawing on works that have been done outside of the field of medicine and medical education. Our agenda will be broken up, therefore, into these two parts. Part one will focus on crisis management, and I'm going to present a little bit of information on the COVID moment, which probably is one of the greatest crises that medicine has ever seen and the greatest crisis that education has ever seen. As such, when those two Venn diagrams intersect, medical education has been particularly hit hard by this moment. So how have we innovated, and what can we learn from this moment? So we'll talk about crisis management. Then we'll talk about change management as it relates to the Accountable Medical Student Education Initiative that we've all been embarked on here. And how do we use the principles of deliberate change management to reflect on how we tried to shape a change in the curriculum. Both will have discussions, some large group, some breakouts. And I hope at the end of this time, you'll be able to reflect on your own journey. I'm going to propose that we start by understanding that there are really three types of behaviors that in organizations and in our profession of medical education that relate to how we change. The first is a responsive behavior, one that is directly attributed to pressure in the system and the reality on the ground. The second is reactionary stance. And this is a direct consequence of the decisions that need to be made in order to provide some degree of stability, sometimes even to restore a previous state. And then there is a proactive stance that an organization can take that is really built upon the principles and a system that helps us prepare for the future, whether it be an unknown future or potentially an unknown future. But I'm going to get us actually thinking about, as we think about that framework and the two concepts of crisis and change management, I'm going to ask you to actually take a minute, pull up a scrap piece of paper in front of you, if you have one. Hopefully you can grab one quickly. And I'm going to ask you to jot down a couple of things that will serve as kind of a connective tissue for you through the remainder of our workshop. The first thing I'd like you to do is just spend a minute or two and jot down your big idea in health sciences education. Many of you are from the basic sciences, many of you from medical sciences, but what is your big idea? It may or may not be something that you're currently working on, but it must be something that you want to work on and inspires you. What big idea, which reflects big change in education, do you want to work on or are working on? So I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Now, what I want you also to do is to jot down a specific small part of that idea that could be something specific that you want to work on, an innovation, a small project, or a project potentially that you're already working on. Preferably something that you're already working on, because I'm going to ask you to draw on that experience in our discussions and in our breakout session. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too hard. You're not going to turn this in, but I'm going to ask you to just keep that piece of paper handy and think about it as we go through the different worked examples and how what we're observing might relate to what you have in front of you as you think about your innovation journey. So let's start by talking about crisis management. Now, crisis management is getting a lot of play these days. There's a lot of speakers that are going around the country talking about this being one of the single greatest crises this country has faced in at least 50 years, if not longer. And really doing a deep analysis in how leaders and organizations are either succeeding or falling short of what is needed based on underlying principles of crisis management. I don't pretend to be an expert in this field, but I'd like us to be thinking about this concept as it relates to innovation in education during a time of crisis and how change happens. Indeed, others have actually written about this. Larry Clark is a professor of business at the Harvard Business School, and he writes frequently in the Harvard Business Review. And he's written pretty clearly back in March when COVID was just breaking, that crises present us with unique conditions that allow innovators to think and move more freely to create rapid and impactful change. So maybe crises are the best times for innovation to occur because obstacles may be removed. So I'd like to actually facilitate a discussion on this, if that's okay, and just get your thoughts as to why you think this might be true. Why might change be easier during crises? And in order for me to do that, I'm going to ask people to either, I think we've got a fair number of people. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here briefly. Yeah, we've got a reasonable number of people. People can either put things in the chat room or you can unmute yourself as you'd like and just give me an idea. Why do you think change is easier during a crisis? And Martha said, because there's often no choice during a crisis. And that's a really important point. Sometimes we are presented with a real stress in the system that offers no real alternatives. We must confront it. And that sort of focuses the organization on how to solve that problem. We move into survival mode. That's absolutely true. And in some crises that are as big as COVID, sometimes it's survival as it relates to individuals' health, but it also could be survival of the organization, may be directly threatened. Rules and regulations may be relaxed. So yeah, there's kind of an unfreezing of the system that sometimes happens. And you'll hear examples of that. But things that sometimes take months, if not years to get accomplished can be done with blinding speed and breathtaking speed because the rules are sometimes relaxed during those times. We can just look at the example of what is trying to happen with regards to vaccination. There's already a lot of change happening. This helps overcome change inertia. That's such an important point. When change is in the system and we're dramatically doing things differently, then other change can happen as well. People are used to that kind of energy. A crisis unhitches us from our notions of how things should be done and removes the fear of change with the fear of a greater challenge, the crisis. So this overrides the original fear and empowers us. Yeah, Diane, that really makes a lot of sense. Where all of a sudden we have our assumptions that were baked into our understanding of the world as it existed before the crisis. Now the world changes. We have to rethink assumptions if we're going to be able to respond in that regard. Change becomes part of the environment, JMO, definitely. As we were talking about, you see change all around you. You maybe even get a little bit more courageous about change. The pain and discomfort of the crisis outweighs the discomfort inherent in change, thus overcoming the inertia against change. Such an important point. We often forget how painful change is. We think about change as being this bright, shining star that we're all moving towards, but change causes pain. And if there's pain already in the system, maybe that pain is not as bad as, or maybe the pain of change is not as bad as the pain in the system. So great point there. And Larry says the powers that be are distracted, so subversives can get away with things. That's a really interesting observation. I don't know how many times I've heard the phrase that Well, I know you've got big things on your plate, so this seems kind of small. So I'm just not, or I'm worried, you've got a lot of things to take care of when we talk to some of our senior leaders. And that's kind of baked into that maybe they're distracted and they may not be paying attention, so that some of the change that you wanted to do may happen quickly. I think telehealth may be a great example of that. There was so much regulation and so much inertia that needed to be overcome. And it just happened from necessity. And in many ways, some of the innovations in telehealth have happened because some of our leadership, whether it be countrywide or in our organization, might have been a bit distracted by other bigger things to work on. So great points. All really important. Let me tell you, I just want to share with you what Larry wrote about as it relates to why is change easier. And many of them you already hit. The first is that the system and its people unite around a purpose. We're all very purposeful and centered on the mission. Second, we see the system differently. And that relates to our perspective, changing assumptions of whether something is an enabler or a barrier. You mentioned also that the organization unfreezes regulations, rules, and also just the change happens so quickly that other people change. The fourth is kind of a mission-centered, that problem solving is what we're all in on. And I can't even, as you think about March, there was so much problem solving happening all around us. We wouldn't just complain. People were always asking, well, what do you want to do about it? Because we got to make some sort of intervention here. And then finally, that there is a bias. He talks about the fact that there is a bias towards action, which really can make things unfreeze as well. So people are not just talking about thoughts, but that there is real things that we need to do. So great job. You definitely sort of observed what a lot of people have observed, not just in education, but really across all organizations during this time. As we really think about how medical education responds, you can see that back in March, as we think about medical education as the case, there was really no choice. This was not business as usual. Not only was education disrupted, but health education and health was disrupted. So we needed to respond. So let's tell a little story of what we saw. And I'll walk you through some of the specific steps that occurred in medical student education that might be illustrative. First of all, where were we in medical education? Well, as we think about the U of M case in March, we had just emerged from transforming the curriculum and we're just starting to see our graduates. The first graduates were graduating in May of 2020. We were deep in the midst of self-study for our accreditation site visit, which was actually scheduled for April of 2020. You all recall that there was growing concerns about awareness about systemic racism, something that has really been in existence for decades, but there was a growing concern about that and its impact on education during this time. And there was real economic stress occurring as well. And layered on top of that was COVID. So imagine all the stress in the system. Any of those could be considered potentially a big change. But the crisis of COVID, in addition to other crises, really made people wonder whether the system could stand this. And was this too difficult for our system to handle? I will say that innovation really helped during this time, and many of the items that you saw before really did help us work through this. But it was a real stress at that time, and we were worried, pretty deeply worried. How did it unfold? Well, let's think back to March. And I don't know if you guys remember some of the steps that were taken by organizations, but I'll just summarize them briefly. On March 9th was when we had our first patient diagnosed with COVID at Michigan. On March 11th, the university made a mandate that all students must move online. And we had to think, well, does that apply to all 4 years of our students or just the first year that was virtual? Well, we had to actually get an exemption for our second, third, and fourth years, keep them in the clinical setting, but move our first year students to being fully virtual. But then on March 17th, despite that, the AAMC and the LCME provided this guidance document that essentially ordered all medical schools to suspend their clinical rotations immediately. They used a lot of language that might have indicated that it was our choice, but it was really not medical schools' choice. And greater than 95% of medical schools at that point suspended clinical rotations, and we were no exception. A lot of it well-intentioned because of shortage of PPE, but it was kind of a shock to the system. So that created a crisis in medical education that honestly were historical firsts, had really not seen before. Certainly we had not seen here at the university. This gives you an idea of where we were when the pause happened just before the peak. These are Michigan COVID cases, and this is cumulative COVID cases as well. So you can see we were really right at the beginning of what would be this massive peak, which would consume the system. And then there would be a flattening of the curve that would go down. And so as we were planning, as we embarked on this crisis, we had to do some planning to figure out, well, what are we going to do? What will our students do in the interim? And when can they come back? Thinking about those two key questions. And yet there was great uncertainty. We did not know how high this curve would go, and we had no idea when this peak would happen. Our own former dean, Jim Williscroft, wrote a fantastic piece commissioned by the AAMC to talk about innovation in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you have not read it, please do. It's a fabulous piece. It sort of envisions what the future looks like and what we should be doing and thinking about as it relates to this. But I'll quote one phrase where he stated that the removal of medical students from their clinical rotations is a profound disruptor, and that the implications for their ethical and professional development as physicians are numerous. And he stated very clearly that now is the time for medical educators to act, not simply to discuss the implications, but to rapidly innovate and develop alternatives to fill the void. It was a clarion call, and we were lucky that we had this somewhat of an innovative culture built into our system to respond. So what were the sort of things that were seen, both here at U of M, but across the United States as well? Online courses, including those on pandemic medicine. There was a lot of virtual education that occurred. I call it virtual XBL, team-based learning, case-based learning, problem-based learning was occurring across the country. Virtual standardized patients, including how do you take a history virtually. Some schools were even talking about how do you do a physical exam virtually through simulation. There was certainly a lot of foundational education that was occurring virtually, but including virtual dissection, virtual microscopy, physiology simulation that students could access online. And then there was a lot of remote presence as well. Remote presence, for example, in surgery education. There were some great pilots looking at how do you do ICU rounding or scrubbing in the OR, but not actually be there using GoPro technology where you'd place kind of a camera and then have students engage remotely. Certainly, there was a tremendous push towards telemedicine and telehealth, as you already heard, with a lot of need to actually teach students about telemedicine in places that hadn't done that already. And then figuring out how to include learners in the telehealth workflow. Admissions needed to go virtual, online screening, virtual interviewing. How are we going to do the match, both for residency admissions and for medical school admissions? And then finally, there was this real call to serve that grew exponentially across the country. Students were taken out of the clinical setting across the country, tens of thousands of students, and they were saying, but we want to be part of the solution. So how can we serve during this time? And so across the country, so many different service corps really cropped up. At Michigan, we had a number of these innovations actually come to play. A couple were really quite prominent and were interesting because they were led by students. So our students stood up in conjunction with our learning community, the M Response Corps, which was a volunteer organization to really face down the crisis. And over 500 students participated in that. But again, student-led, stood up a whole organization with an incredible amount of complexity and deliberate care to processes and applications, Where could they volunteer? There were three types, both helping with the supply chain and kind of the infrastructure. Then there was a type where they would do patient care, but in a virtual space and assist with that. And then finally, there were actually in-person patient volunteer opportunities where our students worked on. For example, serving as respiratory therapy extenders. So M-Response Corps was a huge initiative that was stood up in a matter of weeks by students partnering with our learning community. And then similarly, our students asked, well, how do we learn about pandemics if we're going to be taken out of the clinical setting? And so our students worked with our faculty to develop an 8-week course in pandemic medicine that was fully online, a crowd aggregate of resources that were vetted by our faculty for accuracy and for legitimacy, and then put together in Canvas through a series of 5 chapters. And all of our clinical students were enrolled in that course, stood up in courses typically take 12 to 18 months to create. This course, 40 hours of time, including a lot of reflective and assignments, took 3 weeks to stand up. Like you guys pointed out, regulations and rules went out the window. The organization unfroze and launched this course in a matter of weeks. So these are 2 great examples, and these occurred really across the country, of how organizations respond during a time of crisis. But after the response, there has to be a reaction. At some point, we needed to put our students back. At some point, there's kind of a conservative element of medical education to say, well, this isn't the new normal. We need to restore clinical rotations. We need to figure out how to bring our new students back. And our first-year students who were made online need to start their clinical rotations. So how do we react to the response? And that's called a reactionary stance for an organization. It's actually quite extensively written about. And it's an important part of how change occurs, because you changed already, you need to change back. So what did we do? Well, we had to resume learning. So we started by planning for what our 2s, 3s, and 4s would do. Our 4s needed to graduate. We needed to do match days and graduation, but they were kind of towards the end. Our 3s were really disruptive. They were in the middle of the post-clerkship phase, and they had to embark on virtual applications and interviewing and get back to their electives and sub-Is because they're going to graduate in 2021. And then our 2s, who had their clerkship year interrupted, needed to restart their clerkship. And they needed to then start to study for the boards, which had also become disrupted across the country. So we needed to do deliberate planning for restoring part of the previous state. And we used 3 key initiatives to help support it, but we were relatively successful and returned our students on June 8th, which was among the first in the country. There were, as of August, there were still 30% of medical schools that had not yet returned their students. We returned them quite early because we did a lot of planning to restore the previous state. In addition, we needed to plan for the new M1s who were about to arrive. So they arrived on July 27th. They were in person when essential, and about 80% of their first year is online, but there is still about 20% that they're showing up in person for. And then we also needed to bring our M2s, who were M1s when the pandemic hit. They needed to not only finish their first year, but also come back to start rotations. And I'm pleased to say that they came back on August 31st. We did a lot of online work, but some in-person work, and now they started their clerkships just this past Monday. So we needed to have a reactionary stance as an organization as well. And that is kind of part of crisis management. As anyone will tell you, you can't just walk into a war. You have to figure out how you're going to draw down the war and get back to the previous state, even though the previous state may be fundamentally altered, which it certainly is going forward. So that's just kind of a story of what occurred as we are thinking about from the lens of medical student education. I'd like to actually open it up for discussion for you all to think about what you observe. You are all part of this crisis over the past 6 months, and you all wear different hats. Some of you educators, some of you clinicians, some of you researchers. You often will wear more than one hat, maybe all 3 hats. But in your lens, in your realm, what did you observe across Michigan medicine during our crisis. And again, I'm going to stop sharing and ask people to either put an X in the chat, just like I'm doing here, if you want to unmute yourself, or just add comments in the chat as to what you saw. And it can be any observation, from how people were feeling to how people were acting during these past 6 months as change occurred and as we needed to then restore the previous state. Sure, Sandra.
Sorry for joining you late today.
No, great.
One thing I observed was we were hungry for faster communication and more frequent updates. And some of the strong leaders that I observed really opened those channels, bringing people together, both to share updates because things were changing so quickly, and then giving people space to respond and ask questions. And I think that environment that I saw created helped us come together when very clear-cut moves forward were needed. We had the communication network in place for that.
Fantastic observation, Sandra. And many people in crisis management talk about how important communication is. And I think what I'm hearing you say is we saw some variability in communication styles and frequency and cadence and the willingness to engage. Some were great at it. Some maybe stumbled a bit as well, but that certainly was something important that we needed to see in the system. And we saw quite a bit of really good models of communication. So thanks for that contribution. Martha talks about that safety was at the forefront of our minds, but also some tripping over ourselves to react to the crisis. Martha, could I ask you if you're okay unmuting yourself and maybe explain a little bit about sort of what kind of tripping did we see? Because they're definite, I think I share that observation, but would love to get your perspective on that.
Well, I think what we saw was a reaction to an unknown area. And so often the right hand would say, this is what we're going to do. And we would sleep for a few hours, and then the left hand was telling us almost a contradictory statement at times. So we're going to work from home, but we're not going to work from home. We're going to have the students with us. We're not going to have the students with us. And a lot of that probably came from trial and error. It sounded like a good idea when it came out of somebody's mouth, and then when they tried it, it didn't. I haven't been with the university that long, certainly have never been with the university through a time like this, but it almost was like there was no set, you know, we all work on, in GME, we work on our disaster policies and things like that, but it's almost like we didn't refer to them when the time came. We were so busy reacting, and I think it's because it was it was fast, it was dangerous. And so we were so busy reacting, we didn't take the time to pull out our manual and find out what does our policy say. So we reacted really like there was no policy for disaster. And I would find it hard to believe at the university there wasn't some kind of forethought for those kind of things. So a lot of just, and I think miscommunication. People were saying, you know, we heard a lot of, well, I heard we were gonna, and you really can't operate a training program, a medical facility on I heard. We have to operate on what we know.
So many great points in what you're saying, Martha. I'm just going to highlight a couple. One is, what was our plan? Did we pull something off the shelf, or were we just kind of figuring it out and making it up as we went along? And that's such an important point that many people who talk about crisis management and what to do for the next crisis that we'll talk about in the second half of today, it's such an important point. I didn't see a lot of pulling things off the shelf either. And that led to sometimes contradictory statements. And that phrase that you said, I heard that we're gonna, or I heard, is such a common thing. And there certainly was variability during that time. So great observations there. Christina said that people were anxious about their own health and job security. And on the other hand, many people came together to deal with the challenges posed by COVID, remote teaching, altered resident rotation schedules, et cetera. So imagine a system that fears for itself, and the individuals in the system are worried about their own health and their own security. But you're also pointing out that despite that, people came together to do some real problem solving. How do we do remote teaching? How do we change the schedules? That's an intriguing dichotomy. It exists in a number of crises. I've heard military leaders talk about that exact issue, the crisis of a battle where people's own health is threatened is a real challenging, but requires some key principles for adoption. And this was something that we all were, at least when we didn't know a lot about the disease, we were all worried about our own health as well, or our own economic health as it relates to job security. So great point there. And then JMO talking about the fact that many students were profoundly concerned about their education and future. And I think that was really felt across the country. And I think it could be, there were sort of two levels that I saw, JMO, and I'd love for you to comment on this. One about how am I going to stay on track for my goals, which gets very transactional. But then I also saw students talking about how am I going to learn about this new world of this virus in a pandemic and how and its impact on health with all of the stresses in the system. JMO, did you see more of the former or more of the latter, or kind of an equal dose of both?
I think that was partly stage dependent, and I think that would make sense. So for the later year students, they were concerned about more the transactional. What do I do now? What's going to happen to me? The earlier students were more philosophical about it. How is this going to affect my relationship with patients and my overall education as a physician? One of the things that I also noted in that context, of course, because everybody in the health system wanted to, certainly in the medical school, wanted to support these students, but there was a combination of miscommunication and or just not knowing the right way to communicate, as well as not understanding what the right timing is, because we just didn't have a crisis like this before. What I mean by that is, and this was also at the University of Pennsylvania, because I didn't come here until July, was that the leadership would get together and have very thoughtful discussions, plan things that were really sounded great when we were talking about it. The problem is that by the time we would make an announcement to the students in a collective fashion that, again, was thoughtful and that we could agree upon, it was too late. The students were already at the next phase of worrying about something else, and we were behind. And so there was this prolonged catch-up period where everyone was being thoughtful, trying to be engaged and do the right thing, but the timing was just off.
Yeah.
I don't know what, hopefully you have some ideas, or we have some collective ideas on how to overcome that type of scenario, but I definitely, I think we all saw it, but felt sort of helpless to change it.
It's great observations, JMO. I think the first one being that it really did depend on the level and what people were thinking about what lay in front of them as to how students reacted. But this concept of nimble, frequent communication that is where we walk the tightrope of how much do we process what we're going to say up front, which may inherently create delays in communication, versus how much do you do ongoing communication where you expose students to the ways in which change happens, where people thinking is much more messy, where the message may not be so compact and tight that it's consistent. And there are tensions on both sides. And so it's a good placeholder for us to be thinking about. I will say here, as it related to our communication with the students, we erred on the side of not pre-processing a lot, but having regular bi-weekly discussions where we would try to manage expectations and did a lot of, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question. And we'll try and get it for you, but it may not actually be, it may change. That had its own problems because some people aren't wired that way, but it allowed us to stay, at least from our perspective, stay on top of communication, but even though it may not be completely accurate each time, because there was a lot of, this thing was a fluid situation. I think we heard the word fluid quite a bit. So one last comment from Diane, and then we'll move on. Diane.
Thanks. I just wrote, thanks, JMO, for bringing that up. And Raj, the way you explained it is perfect. It was exactly what we experienced at the School of Dentistry too. And it was at the beginning, everything was changing like hourly. And you couldn't tell somebody because you knew that, you know, in the morning we had this idea and this was going to be our decision of how we were going to handle it. And, you know, much like you said, you're going to keep your 3s and 4s in clinic and doing the rotations in the hospital. And then all of a sudden now you're not. And we had the same situation. And so it was really hard to figure out how to communicate. And we had the same issue with students and communicating with students. And they actually asked us twice, can you communicate it with us more, even if you don't know the answer? And we finally, the second time they asked us, we finally got it. And we put out a weekly communication to the students. And it was just in the areas of clinical education and academic affairs and student affairs. And it was a really, it really helped them to settle in and understand and know what was going on. And a lot of our communication was, we don't have an answer, or we're aiming for doing this by this time, but that could change. And so it was really, it was a real learning curve for us, and how do we communicate with students.
Such a great point, Diane. Thank you. And thanks for sharing with us authentically that journey. We were learning along the way as well. How many of us have managed a crisis like this? And I think, to a point that was made earlier, many of us didn't really have a playbook to draw on where we would sort of think about crisis management. I put that out there because I think the organizations that do crisis management have observed this about medicine and about medical education and feel that we need some help. And maybe we need to be a little better trained for the future. I'm gonna return us to our slides so we can stay on track, and offer that people certainly can contribute as we will have other points of discussion that I'd love to take. But let me just offer that there actually are some principles of crisis management 101 that business and organization and military leaders have put forward. And I'm going to summarize them here. Many of them were already echoed, but this may be some take-home points for us to learn. This is what they advise. First is that we should be assessing the threat and do a lot of work on making sure that the information we receive as leaders is essential and that it's reliable as well. There's so much noise in the system. And they argue that we should be spending a lot of time up front identifying where are we going to get our information from before we disseminate it to others. Number two, determine what resources are required. When a crisis hits, set up a team, identify who our team is, set that up, meet regularly, and immediately start focusing on logistics. In our organization, we set up a response team, which ended up being our deans and directors cabinet. And we met daily online on Zoom, and we processed things every day. When Michigan Medicine set up their command center, they met daily. The academic mission met nearly 3 or 4 times a week. So set up the team structure, determine who the people are, and start moving, and then identify resources early. Something that's a real critical stage that I'm not sure we did. The third is what has already been talked about. Communication is not a nice to have. It may be the most important thing to do. And all leaders all people who talk about crisis management talk about communicating to different audiences, different information needs, and manage expectations about accuracy and fluidity. It's totally fine to say, I don't know. Because in your communication, we should be anticipating the future. Students, faculty, staff, they're already trying to think about the future. That's what is at stake. And so, and being in front of that and saying, we know that we need to make a decision by X, but we don't know the answer to that question right now. And for us to be asking, what's next? What is going to be happening, so that we can anticipate that and put that both into our planning and our communication processes. Again, this was adopted from a seminar series that the AMA put out over the month of August on crisis management. And it's a really interesting a real interesting thrust for us to be thinking about. Many of us wonder, well, maybe this will be the only crisis. Well, I think crises happen more often than we think. COVID-19 may not have been the only one. And maybe some of these principles should pervade regardless of what situation we find ourselves in. At the end of the day, as someone had said, did we have a plan? Well, I'm going to put out there that a quote from a well-renowned leader: plans are useless, but planning is essential. Anyone know who this is from? Sorry, it's hard for me to see the chat room. It's if you didn't know, it's General Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's also ascribed to Richard Nixon as well a little bit later, but I think he was the vice president for Eisenhower, so he probably copied it from him. But Eisenhower said that you got to have plans, but sometimes the plans are useless when you need them, but the planning process is essential. So I'm going to use this to pivot us to planning. How do we embrace the third stance that an organization can take as it relates to change? And it's a proactive stance, because a proactive step can better prepare an organization for future crises. Maybe even develop a plan that would then be pulled off the shelf and analyzed to see how relevant it is for a future crisis. And I would say that sometimes the crises are unknown, but planning is important whether or not the thing you need to change is in response to an unknown crisis, or it may also be to a planned change, something that you are doing that you know is going to be big or is going to cause some disruption to the system. So I want to blend both of those into the concept for the rest of our time together, for the second half of our talk, and really pivot to change management. Change management really comes to us from, again, outside of medicine, outside of medical education, but it's a set of principles and conceptual frameworks that help us organize our work as we deliberately plan how to change for the future, whether it be something that we know is going to happen, or even how to anticipate an unknown thing that hasn't happened yet. The problem is that we usually don't plan deliberately. We try to, but we don't necessarily use conceptual frameworks to help organize our planning processes. And so my hope is to expose you to, if you haven't already, seen some other literature that might be out there that might help us all, because change is constant, and being able to plan for change is something that I think we all need to do in our role as innovators. The three frameworks that have been important to me personally over the past 15 years have been these three. The first is Bowman and Deal. It's a book called Reframing Organizations, which really talks about how organizations are structured and the different forces that help you interpret how organizations behave, and how do you use that to plan for the change you are designing. The second is from Clay Christensen, and he wrote a book called The Innovator's Prescription, but it was based on a paper he wrote in the Harvard Business Review called Meeting the Challenge of Disruptive Change. And the late Professor Christensen, who unfortunately passed away a year ago, really led the way in thinking about what is a disruptive innovation and how do you align your organization to reinvent itself, stating that there is a science behind it. We can observe how organizations do this successfully and not successfully and adopt those principles. And then the third is John Kotter, who's also a professor of business at the Harvard Business School, who talked about why transformation efforts fail. And he wrote a book called Leading Change that identifies key steps that are required in order for successful change to happen. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this is not a mini MBA. This is not even going to give you a satisfying taste of any of these three frameworks. I'm going to skim across the surface of the pond and draw on these three frameworks to then tell a second story. And the second story is going to be the story of how we planned to change the curriculum for medical students here at the University of Michigan, starting way back almost 9 years ago, and really working over the past 9 years towards that. But how we use these three references to help us plan, and how we were, I would say, modestly successful in the change management part of this. All change is hard, but these principles, these books actually really did help us a great deal in planning for that change. So before we do, I'm going to ask you to jump back into, just make sure you've got your piece of paper ready, because this is going to be how I'm going to ask you to reflect on our journey at U of M, and then reflect on what you're planning to do. Because I'm going to put out a thesis, or my hypothesis is that each of you with your big idea you must deliberately plan for that change. And I would offer that these 3 resources might help you be successful in your efforts. So pull that out and let me tell you my story, our story here at U of M. And as I mentioned, this is a story of hundreds of people. So the second case started in September of 2012. And the situation is simple. It's 2012 and the UMM, the medical school has successfully completed its accreditation cycle. Sorry for the typo there. The LCME had just left. We did quite well per their criteria. And in the debrief meeting that the dean hosted of the key leaders of the effort, after the usual congratulations, the dean looks around and he says, now what? Now what are we really going to do? And you can imagine just the key folks in the room letting out a sigh, because we were exhausted by the LCME accreditation cycle. But yet he wanted us to think big about the vision of the new curriculum at this point. And he basically asked us, how can we really now change to develop and implement a truly accountable medical student education program, accountable to society, to train the leaders that we need to do? Now, I'm not going to, again, this is going to be a very unsatisfying description of this journey, but I'm going to do it to kind of highlight the different steps along the way. And then I'm going to ask you to discuss your journey with your small groups. We realized we needed outside help. And that's where the 3 references came in. We actually, a couple of us went and took a course in change management at Harvard, and actually got consultation from both Professor Cotter and Professor Christensen at that time about the change journey we were about to embark on. I'll break this down into the 3 models that we learned. The first one was pregame. We needed to do a pregame analysis. What was Michigan? What had it gone through? And we used this book by Bowman and Deal about reframing organizations to help us review the environment, to really understand whether we were capable of doing what we needed to do, or how to manage that. Bowman and Deal talks about frames of analyses that are used as lenses to understand an organization's behaviors and the issues. And sometimes they're consolidated in order to bring together a broader view. And he talks about 4 of them. The first is the structural frame. Here, organizations are really understood by hierarchy and clear role definitions. And the problems happen when there's confusion in roles and hierarchy. The second frame that could explain a way an organization works is the human resource frame. Here, the frames, the organization exists to help serve the people and serve society, and it's a place for growth and development. But problems happen when people aren't motivated, or they're exhausted, or they're not trained. The third frame he talks about is the political frame. Here, the frame states that organizations are actually cutthroat jungles. There is it's a zero-sum game. When someone is promoted, another one is demoted. When someone's idea is funded, that means someone's other idea is not funded. And the problems happen when you don't understand where power sits and how coalitions are formed. And then the final frame he talks about is the symbolic frame. And here the frame states that organizations are just deeply symbolic units, and successful business is really about how does the organization talk about its meaning and act in that line. And problems occur when people act in a way that's different than the symbol of that organization. Now, Bowman and Deal don't state that an organization is all 4, nor do they state that an organization is only 1. But usually for a situation, there is a dominant frame that helps you understand what has happened. We use this, and we did a pregame analysis of what Michigan was back in 2012. And we identified, and as you're thinking about this, I'd ask you to be thinking about, what frame dominates the unit where you want change to happen? Is it the structural frame, the political frame, the HR frame, or the symbolic frame? That could be important to you as you think about the change you need to have happen. In our case, we identified a whole series of challenges that were a result of this frame. Some you've already heard about. We were tired. The bigness of the proposal of the curriculum we were envisioning was massive. There were a lot of historical memories of previous curricular revision, which made people tired just even thinking about yet another curriculum revision, the previous ones that had happened. There are also ones that were not successful. Other attempts in 1988 and 2008, which were memories for people in the organization to say, are you kidding me? We're going to do this again when we've tried and not done so successfully, or when we've done and done it successfully, it's been exhausting. There were also a real deep analysis where we realized that the real power doesn't sit in the dean's office. It sits in the departments. So what do the chairs think about this role? And the faculty really listened to chairs, and the faculty needed to vote on any change. So this was part of our pregame analysis using the frames. And we realized that at Michigan, the big frames that we needed to be thinking about were the political frame and maybe a little bit of the structural frame, but mostly it was about where does power sit because of this vote. At U of M, the regents state that in all the schools, the faculty, and in the medical school, we've interpreted it to state that the faculty needed to actually vote on any substantial change to the curriculum. So this lay ahead as we looked at Model 1, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 was really asking, how should we structure the change organization? And here we actually referred to Professor Christensen. Now, you all may know that he talked about disruptive change, and that was a coined phrase in the 2000s that got a lot of play. I think a lot of people actually didn't really understand what disruptive change means, according to Professor Christensen. But basically, he states that disruption can be not disruptive to the organization, but it's really a dramatic change that has the potential to really reduce or cannibalize existing processes. In other words, disruptive change really jumps over multiple steps of iteration and proposes something so different that the existing model may cease to exist. An interesting example existed at IBM. IBM was a corporation whose whole organization was based on the mainframe, yet they invented the PC. How did they, not necessarily invent, but they scaled up the PC? How did they do that without cannibalizing their business? It's an interesting model that Clay writes about. The structure he talks about is, he states that in order to decide how you will frame the innovation in your organization, you need to think about two axes, and that there are there's a whole series of processes and culture that influences your answers to two specific questions. Number one, how well does the idea fit within the organization's processes here on the y-axis? And number two, how well does innovation fit within the organization's values? And what he says is you need to make two decisions about how you're going to move forward. Number one, you're going to make a decision as to whether you need to put the innovation unit or the innovation organization unit in the organization or outside of it, either within the existing one or outside in a spin out. And the second decision you're going to make is who sits on that team. Who's going to be the team that leads this change? Is it people from within the organization who already have power or who already make the decisions? Or is it people that are called heavyweights, which are other people that come from outside that have direct connections to power, but may not be the usual people that make decisions? And the IBM mainframe example gives us a great example of what IBM chose to do. They looked at their processes and their values and realized that they actually had poor processes for supporting innovation as they were thinking about the PC, and poor fit of values, because IBM wasn't known for being an innovator back in the 70s when the PC was being decided. So they created a spin-out organization. They took it away from White Plains, New York, put it in Florida to create the PC. And then they reintroduced it into the organization once the PC was developed. That was decision C that they made. What did we do at Michigan? Well, we use this to do a deep, honest, authentic assessment of our culture of innovation, our processes and procedures for curricular management and how change happens, and how our teams function. And what we determined was that we, at that point in 2012, had become really stable. Some people might use the word, we didn't really change that dramatically in the preceding years. And innovation, dramatic change, as was being envisioned by the dean, didn't really fit within the values of the organization. However, the organization actually had great processes for managing change, great committee structures, great values for how procedures should unfold. As a result, and I'll ask you to keep thinking about where do you think your program and unit is as I describe our answer, we decided to go with D. That is that we would bring in different people, but keep it within the organization. We decided not to do a spin out because we felt that a spin out would not capitalize on the good processes that U of M already had. But we needed to get different people at the table because the usual suspects, the lightweight team, were not necessarily oriented towards a dramatic transformation. And as we did that, we created our governance structure for how we would do the new curriculum. We created a steering and operating committee that reported to our curriculum policy committee. We didn't do it within the CPC, we did it outside, but we made sure that CPC oversaw the whole process. We built work groups and we added tons of students, both through a student advisory committee, and we put students on all the work group. And this was done in 2013 to help plan for the new curriculum. This is an important step for us, but it didn't come naturally. We actually got a lot of support and a lot of, honestly, a lot of advice from outside the organization to help us think through how we should structure this. But this may have been one of the most important decisions we made, and it carried a lot of ramifications. Then the third model we turned to was Cotter's model. Now, Cotter outlines how to what are the different steps that an organization or a unit should take in order to make big change happen. And he outlines 8 steps. And these aren't steps he just pulled out of a hat. These are steps that he observed through over I think 200 or 250 interviews and case examples, case analyses of different organizations that had varying degrees of change success. Some eminently successful in making change happen, some not so successful. And he identified what are the key steps that successful organizations took, and also what were the steps that sometimes unsuccessful organizations failed to take or missed when they were trying to make big change happen. And he outlined them here. Here are the 8 steps here. And again, they're nicely codified in this HBR review, and they're also nicely codified in his book, Leading Change. What we chose to do is, and I'll ask you to, again, think about how they apply to your educational efforts. But what we chose to do is to take this one step at a time, even though they weren't intended to necessarily be sequential. We said that, well, let's see how we're doing. And so we held weekly Cotter meetings as part of our curricular change efforts, where we would deeply analyze each of these 8 steps. Well, what did we come up with as we were going through this? Well, first we had to create a sense of urgency, and we did a lot of stakeholder surveys and dialogues. We interviewed alumni. We brought together a whole bunch of people to say, does change need to happen? And what we detected is that people were yearning for big change, because while from within we didn't think big change needed to happen, I mean, after all, our accreditation went great. It was that we didn't feel like we were aligned with what society needed. And that came through a deep sense of urgency as we did a lot of these interviews. We then needed to form a powerful coalition. And we were very fortunate to not only create that governance structure and recruit chairs who were the seat of power onto that steering committee and operations committee, but also a number of faculty and students and staff. But we also were successful in getting the first AMA consortium grants, which became this really powerful platform to talk about national visibility, to help us build an even broader coalition. When things looked dark inside the organization, we could go and get validation that our ideas were reasonable, looking at what some other schools were trying to tackle. And then we had to create a vision. What were we headed towards? Not why were we doing this, but really what would it look like when we got to the future state? And we did this through a series of exercises that took a year to develop this vision. And the vision wasn't the vision of a curriculum, it was the vision of the graduate and what attributes they would have. And you can see the different attributes here. This was a fairly scientific process where we looked through reams of transcripts and identified themes, and then put this back out to the community to validate its accuracy. We then needed to communicate the vision. And what we realized is that we were pretty bad at communication of visions. We needed to get, again, external help. So we spent some money and got marketing consultancy to help us with this. And they built a brand. You'll see this. We actually came up with the name Michigan Medicine before Michigan Medicine came up with the name Michigan Medicine. That became the brand name for our curriculum through this marketing consultancy. But it also allowed us to talk about the vision, create talking points that would help us go on the road and help engage faculty in the why and staff and students. But then we needed to really get people to work on this. And that's where we set up the work groups. And what was really amazing was that we were able to get over 300 participants to work on designing the curriculum. This couldn't be the small dean's office work. We felt that it needed to be really broad, involve faculty, because after all, they needed to vote, but also involve students in co-creating the future. And as I said, we actually had over 150 students working on the new curriculum as we got through this. And that was really directly a result of this fifth step of Cotter. We were actually talked about nationally about this. There was a whole NPR piece on All Things Considered about us using students to help design the new curriculum. And then when we got to the sixth step, we realized that we couldn't just plan. We needed to talk more about whether these were reasonable plans. And in order to do that, we needed to do a bunch of pilots. So we did things in experimental mode. We created small leadership program curriculum modules. We created paths of excellence and scholarly concentrations before we even launched the curriculum. We started to fuse organ systems to bring normal and abnormal together within a course before we even transformed the curriculum. We launched the learning community before the new curriculum was launched. We did all of this before the vote. And that was really critical because then we had conferences and town halls where we would have posters about what we were doing so that faculty and staff and students could see that, yeah, these aren't just theoretical ideas. These are ideas that could relate to the new, that could actually work. And we also talked about the stuff that didn't work very transparently. There were a lot of experiments that didn't work. But we put this out because we needed to do all of this before the vote. And here was the vote. And you'll notice that when we started on this journey, it was 2012. It wasn't until June 2015 that we put this before the faculty to vote, and over 80% supported it. And it was a record turnout. Almost 800 faculty at that time voted on this curriculum. So we felt at that point that we finally had sort of the winds behind our sails and that we could move forward. So I'm going to pause there. And I'm gonna ask, I think we're running just a few minutes late, but I think that's okay. I'm gonna pause there and I'm gonna ask you to look at these 6 steps and think about your plan and your idea and identify in your mind what might be the most challenging one for you, either through direct experience or through indirect or things that you're worried about going forward. Now, I'm actually going to pull an audible here, Molly. I think given the fact that we're at 11:25, I'm just going to facilitate, and we have a small group here, I'm going to facilitate a conversation here. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And we'll be in our large group here. And I think I can see pretty much everyone here. So I'd like you to, what we'll do is I'll ask you to just spend a minute here and think in your head, which of those 6 steps that I identified, and I'm going to type them in the chat so that you have them. Urgency, coalition, vision, communication of the vision, empowering others to act, and planning for and creating short-term wins. So those are the 6 steps. Which one is the most challenging for you specifically? And not because of your skills, but just because of the idea you have. And any examples you might be able to provide would be great.
I think building a new curriculum is challenging, but I think one of the bigger, but if you have a well-focused team of the right people, you can do it. But implementing the curriculum is an entire beast entirely, because you need not just votes from faculty saying, okay, this curriculum is good. You need to have buy-in and action on the part of all the people implementing the curriculum, which is not the committee that built the curriculum. It's an entirely different group of people in different departments. So I think the project I'm working on with another person in the pathology department right now kind of ties in with updated med school curriculum. So on the M2 clerkships on surgery, they spend a teeny tiny bit of pathology on pathology. So how do you make that pathology experience more impactful? Because before they just sit, kind of watch, very passive. And now we're trying to put together a more engaging and interactive curriculum where, and the goal isn't to turn a medical student into pathology, just it's to teach them how pathology interacts with the broader context of patient care. So right now we're working on folders and putting together different case studies, etc. But I think that part, while time consuming, is engaging, it's interesting, and it's feasible. The biggest challenge, I think, it will be communicating this vision and empowering others to run with it once the product is put together. Because if you have a great product, but no one wants to use it or no one knows how to use it, it will fail flat.
Yeah, that's great observation. And thanks for telling us your idea and your story there, Christina. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that communicating where you're going with this and empowering others to take this on as their work as well is really challenging. And one of the things that we needed to do, that we did incompletely, by getting over 300 people to work on these pilots, it became a little bit, it became broader work groups, so that when it went to the faculty, everyone mostly knew someone or themselves had worked in one of these work groups. And so one of the things that I've learned from organizational leadership is that doing a lot of pilots up front and getting many people to do some of the groundwork of the creation may be helpful, because then they, to your point, Christina, I think you framed it nicely, they're bought in because it's their work. And it's easier for people to criticize other people's work. It's harder to criticize your own work. And so great observation there. JMO, I would love to hear what you write empowering as well, which kind of builds on Christina's, but what is your observation? What specifically about empowering others to act is challenging? And any ideas for how we can make that smoother?
Yes, I have ideas on both. So in terms of the challenging, coming from a surgical department, not that surgeons' time is more valuable, but I think surgeons walk around and run around the hospital with the idea that they are always short on time. And I've observed this at multiple institutions now. And so getting action-oriented people to buy in is not that difficult, right? I can form a coalition. I can get them on board. I can communicate with them. Very action-oriented people. but then to actually get them to change their behavior when their whole training mantra, their training paradigm is years and years of work and indoctrination that leads to some kind of behavior. It's really hard to get them to do something that they've agreed to, so to speak. So I think that empowering is, on the surgical side, at least I felt, is very, very difficult. And the type of curricular change that I wish that we could really enact is going a little back in history, but also using science and what we know about education. The idea that we can use educational principles and behavior change principles, to me, is very exciting. On the other hand, when you actually listen to the learners, especially on the surgical trainee side, what they want more than just this is how you do the surgery, is they want to be really sort of, what's the right word? They want to be surrounded by people who care about them, who are going to take interest in what they do. And so it's not, here's a chapter you could read on how to do this, but in the middle of the surgery, let me take a few seconds to really show you how it's done. Then that personal connection really makes a difference. And the trainees really yearn for that, even though most GME programs are all about the structure and how we get that information, that knowledge and skills to them, but they really want the attitudes. So the idea is that our structure is already good for giving the technical skills and the know-how, but how can we change the culture so that the attendings don't spend time just on skills per se, but really on the development of that individual, right? What are the things that particular resident needs, and spending extra time really working on the development of that person as an individual, using the scientific principles, but in a very personal kind of way. And while people, when you talk to the other surgeons about this, they say that sounds great, but to get people to act or change their behavior in the operating room or in the clinic is very hard. Yeah. So one of the things that I've tried, I'm actually trying right now, is just trying to create incremental change. So I've asked the faculty to sort of buy into this feedback program, because that's one of the aspects that we've identified as something we need to improve. I've given them a 6-step program, and basically here's step number 1, please execute step number 1. Number 2, please execute step number 2. So trying to get the behavioral change a little by little, having that interact with the residents so that they get some positive feedback based on that change, and then building up the behavior change by incrementally changing behavior, even though what I'm trying to do is more disruptive.
So Jamo, thank you. And it's such a thoughtful description of what sounds like a real big task of transforming culture. I think one reflection I have, I mean, it's such a tall order, and everything you say makes sense. Whenever I hear that, whether people, when we start with, it's not necessarily the way I was trained, but I want to believe, and I want to believe that something new has happened. What I realized, and again, I'm just speaking from personal experience, when we started, we weren't doing a very good job at the beginning of communicating why we needed to change. The way I presented it to you was a nice sort of linear progression, but it was anything but, as I think Larry probably remembers better than anyone else on this call. And we realized almost a year into it that we had people working on things, but they still didn't really understand why we were moving in that direction. And we had to reset and spend almost 3 or 4 months putting together real thinking around how do we articulate why we need to move forward that would resonate with people based on real information. And so we needed to reset, and we lost time. I mean, one of the reasons we went from 2012 to 2015 before a vote is that I lost a year of really needing to reset and restate the why, and then do a campaign for why. And it was a very simple campaign. It wasn't about this is what the new curriculum is going to look like. It was really talking about bringing health outcomes, well-being data, the structure and its misalignment with longitudinal development. I mean, I could recite these in my head because it became just 5 points. And the other thing we needed to do is we needed to get the dean to say these 5 points over and over again. It can't be about the cool new technology. It just has to be about these 5 reasons why. So I don't know if that pertains. Maybe it resonates with others, but sometimes my learning through this process was I thought we had established why, and we really hadn't. And most of the books that I read about why state that you can't spend enough time on returning to why. Laura puts a beautiful reference here, Start With Why, by Simon Sinek. And there's a great TED Talk about that Simon has put out as well. But I challenge us to think even beyond that, because Simon talks about start with why. I think you have to return it and bake it into everything you do in both the pilot phase and in the implementation phase. It seems to be one of the biggest lessons. So I would say why should be everywhere, not just at the beginning. So great thoughts. I'd love to give others an opportunity to maybe just share one more reflection on an idea. Obviously, you've all got great ideas, and hopefully this is giving you things to think about. And I promise to share these resources with you afterwards. But other thoughts from the group? Feel free to put an X in the chat. Larry, as the wise sage you're always called upon, any other reflections of lessons that you would give to, young aspiring educators who want to make big change as it relates to Kotter's steps?
Well, I guess it really fits in with your discussion about why, because for me, for Kotter's steps, the vision thing is always the big challenge to not so much come up with the vision, because I think we have a lot of creative people, but it really is the the communication of the vision, and that centers around why. Mm-hmm. So what, this is what we ought to do, but convince me why. Yeah, that's where the kind of professional skepticism of an academic institution really makes it a challenge.
Yeah. I agree with you. And one of the other arguments, I think you're bringing up a really important point that I'd like to convey as another lesson learned from my standpoint. And that was how, initially I was totally annoyed by all of the why questions from faculty. I thought I had communicated this, and it would really grate on me as someone who was trying to shepherd a new way forward. Yeah. But I grew to love it. Not just appreciate it, but then realize it's such a fundamental value to us in the university to embrace the curious, but also the critique that happens, and then use that to then firm up your own arguments. Instead of, initially my response was frustration. I actually then started asking people, why do they believe the way they do? And that revealed such an important set of lessons for our work going forward. And sometimes we're not that curious. When people criticize us, we might just be wanting to either dismiss or ignore or answer and move on. But sitting with them and then asking them why they believe that can really help inform your way forward.
Well, and I think another important characteristic of leadership that doesn't get much press and is a pretty short supply around here is that humility. To recognize that your idea sounds wonderful to you, and you can't understand why anybody else could disagree with you. But the fact is, that you as a leader and as an innovator kind of had the responsibility of going the extra mile to make that vision transparent. And if they don't understand it, it's like a journal review of an article. If the reviewer doesn't understand it, it's your problem, not theirs.
Not theirs. That's right. And that's a value built into our academy, which I think is really, I think it's one that we have to embrace. Certainly, we can't ignore it because that's where we want change to happen. We have to understand what those values are. Wonderful discussion, everyone. I'd like to take you through the remainder of our story and maybe some next steps as you think about your own journey. I will say that Kotter has 8 steps, not 6 steps. And the seventh step was actually referred to by Christina when she talked about the implementation side. The implementation is often forgotten about, but is so critical and is as important, if not more, than the ideation phase or the piloting phase. And so Cotter talks about how there's a seventh step of needing to consolidate these improvements to produce even more change. And then as you start to do that, you realize this problem, which is change is hard and change can cause toxicity. And I'll just reflect that we had two big problems as we were doing the implementation. The first is change fatigue. Two accreditations, one in 2012, one in 2020, sandwiching being the bread that sandwiches the meat of this curriculum change. Our organization is exhausted with all the change. And then we talk about CQI and needing to change and change again. That creates more fatigue. And then you layer on being online. It's a tough area, and it's a challenge that we have to face. In addition, we had brought more people into the organization, which made decision-making less nimble, more democratic, but maybe less nimble. And we needed to directly confront, and we're still in the midst of confronting, how do we create a more nimble decision-making structure with all these people now who are involved in medical student education. And then the second group of challenges was really the departments and faculty. You remember me saying at the pregame analysis, the power sits with the chairs in the department. There's no question about that. Well, that continued to rear its, to come forward as threats as we focused on implementation, especially as Michigan Medicine reorganized and we didn't have a single dean and a single CEO and a single EVPMA, but they were all kind of merged into one person with a whole series of a more matrix leadership structure that created more complexity as it related to faculty engagement, departmental engagement. It made information sharing more challenging. And it also made the concept of balancing the missions more difficult for all faculty. How do we stay clinically active and clinically productive while we want to devote significant amount of time into making change happen in education? Whether you're a residency director or in medical student education or just teaching on the front lines, that challenge has become even more prominent over the last few years. So these are challenges without answers, but they're a direct result of step 7. Step 8 is an intriguing one, and I'll conclude our workshop today with this. And that is, Cotter talks about how you need to then take that change and institutionalize these new approaches. And this is really the beginning of what we are now calling RISE at Michigan Medicine. An institution-wide innovation initiative was part of the strategic plan from the dean's office 2 years ago, which has resulted now in a new pilot, and the goal being to institutionalize innovation in a way that preserves the nimble decision-making, ideation, but also a focus on implementation. And it's just getting started. So I don't blame you if you haven't heard of it yet. It's still quite early, but RISE stands for Research and Innovation and Scholarship and Education, where we focus on influence and impact for all of health sciences education. Not just UME, but really both the MD tracks and PhD tracks. And the goal being for better health, that education should directly improve health. And we should be investing in innovations where we can draw that together, never forgetting that we have an obligation to improve the health of society. There are many different gears that have been put together that are all interconnected, that are part of RISE. I invite you to learn more or follow us on Twitter by going to the website. You can also join our community of practice at the website, rise.med.umich.edu. But this is really a direct response to the 8th step that Cotter put forward. How do you institutionalize change? There are many different ways to do it. This is one of those ways, and we're optimistic that when the next set of big or small ideas need to go forward to change education, that RISE could serve as a resource to help enable that, using the principles of change management and crisis management. So to conclude, if you're thinking about these two concepts of crisis and change management, hopefully you saw that there are some overlaps in both that we could draw on. In both situations, change happens. But in all three, for crisis management, it does tend to focus more on the responsive and reactionary side. And change management focuses on the current state and a more proactive state. But what's interesting is the three themes that seem to emerge over and over is that communication is of the essence and maybe one of the most important things we do in both. That teamwork is required. This is not an individual that is a solo virtuoso, that it requires a team in both circumstances. And that may be antithetical to the promotion and tenure value of a university, but teamwork is baked into both of these. And then finally, planning is essential for both. Hopefully when the next crisis happens, we'll be able to draw off of our reflections from today, from these past 6 months, and dust off a playbook that would help inform the way forward. But clearly when we have a known change ahead, we should be doing more planning than we are right now. And hopefully that will help us move forward in a more successful way. This is a mountain to climb. This is a view from the top of the mountain, but we should always look back and realize that it's a trudging effort that is difficult, but can be rewarding because you can get then to the top of the mountain together. So thank you for all of for your participation, for thinking about your own ideas, and hopefully some of these ideas help relate you more closely to the ideas. I want to encourage you to connect with us in RISE. If you have a big idea and you need help with, we'd love to really learn about that and have you discuss it at various different forums that we have. And here are the references that I put forward many of which come from outside of medical education. If I could leave you with one thing, is I will tell you that my life has been shaped certainly by my mentors and by my work in med ed, but I'm really influenced to think differently by getting different perspectives from those outside of medical education and often those outside of medicine. Thank you.